Hello, Sally Ann here, PT Skills. This bite-sized video is on the types of joints. So we're still working on the skeleton. So grab your notebook and pen. There's quite a lot of information here because we've got quite a few different types of joints within our body. So let's crack on and make sure you're ready to make some notes. We'll have a little task at the end. Let me just share. So looking at those types of joints. So what is a joint to start with? So a joint is where two or more bones meet. Simple as that. It's where bones meet within the body. So they will form a joint, and there's very different types of joints that they may form. So we may have an immovable joint or a fixed joint. So something such as the skull is a fixed and movable joint. We don't really want any movement in that joint because it's protecting our brain. We've got slightly movable joints such as the vertebrae, and then freely movable or synovial joints such as ball and socket in your shoulder, in your hip, hinge joints. So there's three types of basic joints. So make a note of those three types of joints. So we've got the immovable, as I've just given an example of. They don't move. They're fibrous connective tissue. They're going to interlock or overlap, held together with that fibrous tissue. There's no joint capsule, and obviously they're because our bones are for protection. These joints, specifically within the skull, are going to be protecting our brain. So you have the immovable or fixed joints. We've got the slightly movable joints, such as those in the vertebrae. They're going to allow slight movement within the body, as in the description insinuates there. So slight movement is possible as the pads of cartilage compress. So if we're looking at the vertebrae there, you can see that you've got a cartilage pad that's going to compress, which is going to allow our spine to move slightly. So you have your slightly movable joints. And then you've got the synovial joints, which are we have plenty within our skeleton of these. So they've got synovial membrane, a joint cavity, articular cartilage, ligaments, remember, bind bone to bone, and they allow greater ranges of movement. So we have different types of synovial joints. So under your heading synovial, you're going to be able to write these different types of synovial joints. We know what tendons and ligaments do. We've gone over that already. Remember, tendons, muscle to bone, and ligaments bind bone to bone. There is a separate video on that. Anyway, so here are our types of synovial joints. So we have got 6 types. You've got gliding, hinge, pivot, condyloid, saddle, and ball and socket. So 6 types of synovial joints, and we're just going to go over briefly all of these joints. As I say, it's a bite-sized video. I'm whistling through here. So your gliding joint, such as within the carpals, it's where two surfaces meeting together and they're gliding. So they can kind of glide in very different directions, not very far, because they tend to find bone that is then going to hit some bone. So a little bit of diagonal left and right. So like two flat surfaces rubbing together there. So they can only glide across one another. Movements will be such as gliding movements and inversion and eversion, such as in our feet. There we go, a little picture there of a gliding joint, or an example of the two flat surfaces. Then we've got a hinge joint. Most of us will know of a hinge joint. It's just like the hinge of a door, hence it's called that. So only one plane of movement there. So flexion and extension at a hinge joint, such as in your knee, for example, or your elbow. So flexion and extension, where the locking of two bones mean that they can only move on that one axis. So therefore, rotational movement is limited there. So hinge joints, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. So your ankle is a hinge joint, your elbow, your knee. Okay, and there's an example of how they fit together there. And then we've got a pivot joint. We've already discussed a pivot joint within our vertebral column. So pivot joint, there's one at the neck. So on the atlas and axis, as we're rotating our neck, that's a pivot. So almost like a pin in a hole, maybe. Radius and ulnar, we've got that rotation here. So that's a pivot joint in our radio-ulnar joint as well. So as you can see, it's just rotating around one axis there. Okay, so rotation, pronation, supination at a pivot joint. So obviously the radial ulnar joint here, that's pronation and supination, yeah, at the elbow there, and then rotation through the neck. So that is your pivot joint. condyloid joint at the wrist. It's more of an oval shaped joint, so it's two boles nesting together. So you can see it's this oval shaped joint at the wrist here, so very limited on rotation set there. So if you actually hold your wrist and try and rotate through that joint, it doesn't, but it will flex and extend, and it will adduct and abduct. Yeah, not really much rotation going on there. So that's your condyloid. It's like it's similar to a ball and socket, but a little bit shallower. So the movement there, flexion, extension, adduction, abduction. We can take it into a little circle as well, can't we? Bit of circumduction, but not much rotation going on within that joint. So this is your condyloid joint. And the saddle joint, so your thumb is a saddle joint. So you can see the thumb as that moves, that's your saddle joint. It's like a horse or a rider sitting on a horse, the way the joint goes over each other. Okay, and we've got flexion, extension, adduction, abduction within that joint as well. So no rotational movement there. It's quite restricted by the ends of the bones. So saddle joint, and then you've got ball and socket, a bit like a pestle and mortar there, where you've got the ball fitting into that socket. So there's quite a big range of movement. In fact, you can fit all the movements in there. The only downside of a ball and socket is that it can move so much that therefore we could become injured. So if you think of the shoulder, it is one of the most mobile ball and socket joints. It's a mouthful. One of the most mobile ball and socket joints even. So we can move a great variety of direction with our shoulder, but that does lead us into risk of injury because of the amount of movement that we can create throughout the shoulder. Okay, so all the movements available there. We've got flexion, extension, hyperextension, horizontal flexion, horizontal extension, internal rotation, external rotation. Can bring it towards the body, away from the body. You can circle it around. So a lot of movement can happen at that ball and socket in the shoulder. Okay, that's the end of the slideshow, and I haven't actually put a slide on there for your task, but I have a task for you nonetheless. So your task for this is to write down the 3 classifications of joints. So what were the 3 classifications of joints that I gave you at the beginning? And then under synovial joints, I want you to write the 6 types of synovial joints that we have and the movements available at each synovial joint. So what movements can those synovial joints do? So you should have 3 classifications of joints and then 6 synovial joints. So what were those 6 joints that I've just gone through, and what were the movements at the 6 joints, if you choose to accept it? So you can write that out. If you want to take a picture and upload it, please do. If you have any questions, then let us know, and I shall see you soon.